Nubia, The Rise and Fall of African Empires is a book I wrote to educate people about the grand civilizations and high cultures of Africa. I wanted to challenge the popular image of African cultures as primitive and unaccomplished. Now, my book isn't the only book that covers this topic, but when I was young, there weren't many books on African empires. It was pretty plainly stated that African cultures were illiterate, that Africans had no architecture beyond mud huts, and most of the imagery of Africa was of nearly naked tribes. There has been so much archaeology and research lately that anyone who still holds those beliefs is far outside the mainstream of history. But very few people are familiar with the newer research. And there's a reason for that, unrelated to issues of race. The reality is that academics write for other academics. And so a lot of books that cover African archaeology or Sudanology are obscure. They're dense. They're really challenging to read. They aren't written for the mass audience. And that's where I come in. I love history, but I wouldn't consider myself to be a historian. I'd rather you think of me as a translator of history. I wanted to put all of that academic research and those boring books into plain language. I wanted to tell the exciting story of African history. I wanted to paint a vivid image of life in an African civilization. And I also wanted to put Africa's empires into the context of world history. And that is where I think I make a unique contribution. Where Africa's kingdoms fit in the ancient world isn't ever really highlighted. How Africa's rulers related and interacted with kings and queens of cultures outside of Africa isn't often discussed. The impact of African kingdoms on world history is a completely neglected topic. I wanted to write a book that was academically rigorous and avoided embellishing African cultures. I didn't want to write a book that tried to paint African civilizations as the same as European cultures. This happens every once in a while when we use certain civilizations as a standard to achieve. There becomes this pressure to highlight the parts of African civilization that are similar to those non-African cultures. But I wanted to paint an honest picture of black cultures that showed its incredible achievements, assessed its faults, and explained how African cultures helped shape world history. And lastly, most of all, I wanted to explain what happened to those African cultures. Where did they all go? You can find my book, Nubia, The Rise and Fall of African Empires, on Amazon.com, and you can subscribe to this channel to watch short videos on the history of African civilization.